And that looks like us live. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our second CPD accredited webinar. This one titled Vulnerable Customers. Still in the Keeping in the Loop brand, but it's great to be back. Thank you for joining us on the last session, and thank you for joining us here. Introductions. I'm James. I'm your digital BDM here at the Darlington, and I am joined by Mr. Daniel Ferguson, who is our senior outcome tester. Would that be right, Daniel?
Kind of, yeah. It's a little bit more formal than that. So, hello everyone. I'm Dan. I am the testing and quality control lead for Darlington Building Society.
Oh, sorry, Dan. I've done you out of some
You've
title there. I
yeah,
apologise.
you've done me over there. But just a little bit of background as to kind of what that job entails and how I've kind of got here. So, very briefly, started my career at HSBC customer facing roles. I've been where you are. I was a mortgage broker for quite some time. Came over to join the mortgage team within Darlington Building Society, and then took a little bit of a sideward step into kind of the outcome testing role upon the implementation of Consumer Duty, and then ended up getting to the point where I was kind of leading that team and leading the charge on kind of the outcome testing and the quality control side.
Brilliant, brilliant. And it's all under that Consumer Duty banner, which we all know so much about. And this session around vulnerability, you are going to be our professional and give us a lot of info on the how, the whys, and the whats. Now,
Absolutely.
before we kick off, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping. So everybody who has registered to be on the webinar will get an email of the session. We are going to record it. If anybody does have any questions, please use the chat facility and we'll get the questions at the end. It is a bite-sized session. As you can imagine, we might not get through all of the questions, but if we don't, we will follow them up in an email afterwards. So should we crack on? Should we crack on, buddy? I've got some stats that I'm going to kind of start with. Now, this was news to me that 49% of UK adults display one or more characteristics of vulnerability. And so potentially vulnerable, the FCA expectation is that us, firms, individuals, brokers, offer the appropriate level of support to that vulnerable customer. You know, the bar's been set really high, you know, since that introduction of Consumer Duty. But that stat, Dan, that I was just chatting to before we started, it's high. It's like one
It
in two.
is.
That's
So
me and you. That between me and you, one of us potentially has got a vulnerability.
absolutely, and I think there's a couple of kinds of points to make on the back of that. So the first point is that that statistic is from the FCA Financial Lives Survey, so that's as close to an official statistic as we can get, because ultimately the regulator that are regulating ourselves and the firms and the individuals, they're the ones that have given us that information, so it's the most kind of relevant figure. There is potentially some companies out there that have done their own research that will give you lower figures and higher figures, but ultimately that's kind of the closest we can get to an official figure. I think the key kind of nuance with that is that that individual will display a characteristic of vulnerability. It's very important to note that that doesn't necessarily mean that they are vulnerable and that they need additional support. The
Mm-hmm.
only way we can ever understand that is by asking the relevant questions and being diligent on our side. So ultimately, it's looking out for those triggers where the individual has displayed a characteristic of vulnerability. But the key point from there is ascertaining whether that makes them actually vulnerable and whether they need the additional support. And that's where we come in. So, yes, it's a high figure, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all 49% will be vulnerable. It means they've got the potential to be, and they're the individuals that we need to be asking more information from.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. I was just thinking myself, you know, I probably fall under a few characteristics. You know, you can see the show stick in the background. You know, I've had problems with my eyes, and when I went through my mortgage journey, the mortgage advisor that I was speaking to, through good questioning, highlighted them to see if there was any support that I needed. I imagine some people may find it difficult, don't class themselves as vulnerable, but it's not kind of a who's who type of thing. It's all around support. That's the whole kind of ethos of it, is supporting. So why, you know, why is it important, Dan, to identify and support vulnerable customers? You know, why is it being put in place?
Yeah, I think ultimately there's two answers to that. So the first answer is it's important that we support vulnerable customers because it's the right thing to do. Ultimately,
Hmm.
we're industry professionals, you're mortgage brokers, we work for a financial firm. It's just the right thing to do to offer that support to a vulnerable customer irregardless. However, that is also backed up by the fact that it's regulation. So we do it because we want to and it's the right thing to do, but we also do it because we have legislation that tells us that we have to do that. So ultimately, I think it's getting to the point whereby it's twofold. We do it because we want to and it's the right thing to do, and we all want to have the best possible relationship and provide the best possible service to the individuals that we're interacting with, whether that be applicants, whether that be members from our point of view, James. So it's important that we do it. I think you've already kind of touched on it. It's important that we offer support to vulnerable members because there's so many of them. So ultimately, 49% of which some of them are going to be vulnerable. You are going to interact on a daily basis or a weekly basis with individuals that display those characteristics of vulnerability. I think long gone are the days where you can kind of say, we don't deal with vulnerable people. That would be specialist mortgage brokers, that would be specialist lenders, etc. I think because vulnerability is so kind of broad, we are going to be dealing with vulnerable individuals, and it's important that we give them the level of service that they need to be able to kind of have the best relationship with them. So I think crucially, it's the fact that the regulations tell us to do so. I mean, the FCA guidance for the fair treatment of vulnerable customers, that's been in place since 2021. There's always been an onus and an expectation to treat customers fairly. However, the FCA have been very, very specific in the type of support they want firms to provide. And then the bar was raised even higher with the implementation of Consumer Duty back in 2023. So ultimately, we do it because we want to, and we also do it because we need to and we have to, based on the legislation and the policies that are out there.
Yeah, I think probably, as you say, it's something we want to, and we probably always have. But it makes me think of kind of when you were doing maths at school, you had to write your workings out down, and it feels
Yeah, yeah.
like this legislation is we are writing our kind of workings out down and showing that the support is in place, and we're trying to identify the support as well. So that is brilliant. So identifying vulnerable customers, that's probably kind of the next logical thing. Is it something as simple as just pointing out, are you vulnerable, Dan? Are you vulnerable? Or is there a bit more to it?
It's not. I mean, ultimately, when you look at 49% of people, then yes, one in two people that you interact with will display characteristics. So yeah, you're not far off just saying, are you vulnerable? Are you vulnerable? However, I think we are kind of aware of the FCA and the fact that, you know, with some of their rules and expectations and guidance, they do speak in riddles. They're not very specific in what it is that they want you to do. It's all open to interpretation. We're fortunate in that the FCA have been very, very clear in as to what they define as a vulnerable customer. So ultimately, if you refer to the FCA guidance for the fair treatment of vulnerable customers, I believe a link's going to get shared in the end of this presentation.
It is.
But there is a grid within that that'll document every type of vulnerable customer that you may interact with. Now they're split into four separate categories. So you've got your capability, you've got your life events, you've got your health, and then you've got your resilience. And even within them, they will break it down even further. So, you know, your life events might be bereavement, loss of a loved one, it might be loss of a job. Within your health, it's a little bit more kind of clear. So I think it is just a case of when you're speaking to these customers, you can just refer to the FCA guidance and you will be able to kind of cross-reference the two, what you've got sat in front of you, that individual and the characteristics of vulnerability they're displaying. You would then be able to link it to the FCA guidance, and it's very, very clear in that. I think that kind of links into the next point in that vulnerability, it's so kind of broad reaching, if you like. There's going to be some
Yeah.
that are very, very obvious to spot. Your individuals that are hard of hearing, the ones that are partially sighted, and they also come with potentially slightly easier support mechanisms that we can offer to that individual. However, there is a lot more subtle ones. So one that we see from time to time within Darlington Building Society is individuals that aren't particularly confident using technology, and that's why they've came to us, because they like that high street presence and they like to be able to pick up a phone and talk to someone. They like to be able to go into a branch and talk to someone.
They do,
Now
Dan. They get comfort, don't they? You know,
they
being that
do.
having that omni channel, I suppose, is a really good thing to support people in that way.
Of course it is, and I mean, we ultimately provide the support mechanism without even realizing we're doing it. If your applicant that sat in front of you said, "I don't do email, can you send letters?" We would do that. We would accommodate it. Now, ultimately, that is a vulnerability in low digital skills, and it's a suitable support mechanism in the way that we interact with that individual. So I think it is just kind of being a little bit switched on, looking for those keywords and triggers. You alluded to it, James. No one's just going to come out and say, "I am vulnerable and I need support." Some
Yeah.
will, many won't. It's therefore up to us to just kind of use the guidance so that we know what those vulnerabilities are and those drivers are. We look out for keywords, triggers, indicators, and the key is once we've identified that they've displayed a characteristic of vulnerability, we only then know if they are truly vulnerable and need that extra support by asking that question. So you're right in what you say. We ask the question. However, there's a little bit of work that goes into it before we ask that question.
Yeah, I think that's key, isn't it? Conversation, knowing your
It is.
customers. I know brokers on here, they will. It's just your workings out. I'm going to say it again. It's your workings out. You've done it probably for years. You've identified things, but we're just writing it down a little bit more and passing it along so everybody through that journey is aware, and everybody through that journey can hopefully put reasonable, adjustments in place to support that person. But can you give us some tips of what brokers should be, looking out for to identify that vulnerability? I know we've mentioned, conversations is key. Is there any other kind of snippets that you can give us, Dan?
Yeah, I think it is just those key words and key triggers that we need to look out for, and ultimately, a vulnerability is likely going to have an impact on the way that they interact with you as a mortgage broker or us as a firm. So ultimately, someone could lose a loved one and they cope with it absolutely fine and they don't need that support. However, if you're presenting your mortgage advice to someone, if you're providing your recommendations and they say, actually, I've had a bereavement and my head's all over the place, maybe that's the person that you kind of probe a little bit further with, ask the relevant questions and identify them as vulnerable and agree that support, which might be providing the recommendation in writing so they can take it away and actually kind of review it at their own pace rather than having to agree something there and then. So I think it's looking out for the keywords and triggers, linking that back into a vulnerability driver, and then asking the relevant questions from there and agreeing the support. I know one of the kind of questions that we wanted to come to, and I'll kind of lead us in there because that's where we're going anyway, but it's what's the expectations of a mortgage broker once they've identified a vulnerable customer?
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the key. It's one thing identifying a vulnerable customer or a vulnerable applicant, but that's only the first part of the process. Once we've identified them as vulnerable, that just leads us to what we do next. It's not the end of it. And I think the key is what can we do as a mortgage broker, as a lender, as a firm, as a mortgage provider, as a colleague of Darlington Building Society, whatever it may be, what can we do that's now going to make your interaction with me easier going forward based on the vulnerability that you've displayed? So again, the support mechanism, it's going to vary from vulnerability to vulnerability, and some are going to be a lot more straightforward. If someone is hard of hearing, then maybe it's providing things in writing rather than going into detail verbally. However, if someone's lost a loved one or if someone's lost their job, the support that they need is going to vary massively from individual to individual. So I think we identify the vulnerability. That's the first step. The next step is saying, what can I do for you that's going to make your interactions with me or my colleagues moving forward a more straightforward transaction based on the vulnerability that you've displayed to me? And I think that's kind of the next step in that process, James.
Yeah, totally agree, mate. So we've understood the why, the how, and the what. We've got our brilliant brokers who've had an appointment with a customer and they've identified that vulnerability, whatever that might be. Their next step is to tell us. There's probably a few different ways, Dan, I can imagine, that a broker would be able to tell us, which I know we'll go into detail. But the first interaction that a broker would generally have with us when presenting a case is via our online system, so DIP or app. Good news is, through the work that you guys have done, what do we have, Dan, on our MSO system now?
So we now have the functionality, James, whereby a mortgage broker during the application process can advise us that their applicant or their client is vulnerable. That's absolutely brilliant. It's something that we've identified kind of early on within outcome testing,
Yeah.
fairly recently after the launch of Consumer Duty, and we started really getting into the outcome testing. We found that there was just that little kind of barrier, if you like, that little hurdle whereby there was no obvious channel for a mortgage broker to let us know. Now, ultimately, that's one of many channels.
Hmm.
As the brokers will hopefully know, you can pick up the phone, you can speak to your BDO, your BDM, you can speak to our lovely intermediaries team, you can speak to the underwriters, you can speak to a DBS colleague and let them know that the client or the applicant is vulnerable, and we can kind of take ownership of that from there as to what that looks like and the support that we can offer, etc. So I think, yes, the key is, first and foremost, we need to obtain consent from that customer, because we're potentially going to be sharing details that they're not comfortable being shared, and we can't do anything until we've obtained that explicit consent. If anyone wanted a little bit of kind of extracurricular activity, you can look at the Texas model. That's kind of the model that we could follow in order to get that consent. We can thank the customer for letting us know. We can obtain the consent, etc. So that's kind of the process. But once we've got that consent and we need to let the lender or the mortgage provider know, it's then just a case of letting us know. That's the key. The channel that you use is going to be what's best for you. MSO, absolutely brilliant. You're already in the system submitting the application. It's very easy to let us know. However, if you want a little bit of support and guidance, we've all got the same end goal here, which is providing the best level of support for that applicant, for that client, for that mortgage holder when the mortgage completes. And therefore, if you need a little bit of support at the early stage, before just logging it on MSO, pick up the phone and just run the scenario by us, and there's going to be people here that can help.
Yeah. And the good news is, once we've been identified of that vulnerability, that will stay throughout the mortgage journey, if it's at the start, or it'll be updated on our back office systems, so we can then identify what the best support is for that vulnerability as well. So, that is your job, to identify it to us. We can then put the things in place that we need to do. Whose job is it, Dan? Is it just the brokers? Should they be pointing it out to us, or should it just be us?
I'm
Leading
going to sit
question, Dan.
I'm going to sit on the fence here, James, and I'm sure everyone knows what's coming, but ultimately it's both of our responsibilities.
Yeah.
So it's the right thing to do for both of us. It's the right thing for you to do as a mortgage broker, and it's the right thing for us to do as a business, as a mortgage provider. So it's both of our responsibilities. But crucially, the legislation and the expectations set by the FCA, they apply to firms, they apply to individuals. So it's both of our responsibilities. One doesn't kind of diminish the other. Ultimately, there's going to be instances where they might not display the characteristic of vulnerability to the mortgage broker, but they do throughout the lifetime of the mortgage. Then it becomes our responsibility because it's in our world then. But I think if it's during the application process and the broker has identified it, it's the broker's responsibility to let us know. It's then our responsibility to follow our processes and do the right thing from there. So it's both of our responsibilities. Again, the reason for that is twofold. It's both of our responsibilities because it's the right thing to do. It's both of our responsibilities because that's what legislation dictates.
Yeah, it's the right thing to do, isn't it? Why wouldn't you want to, help someone and make, their potential vulnerability more manageable, in whatever sense, but in this kind of financial sense, that support may be, really, really needed. So I think it's good. I think the vulnerability as a whole has been great for us. It's definitely took us on a journey in our world. And yours, Dan, you've pointed out lots of brilliant things. How often should we be looking at this? How often should we be assessing interactions around vulnerability with customers, with people? Is this just a one and done? Do we just need to identify it at the start and then that's it throughout, or do we need to revisit it?
I think it's a great question, James, and I think ultimately the answer to that question is it's going to be no, it's not a once and done. If you just want a simple answer, no, we don't identify the vulnerability and agree a support mechanism, and that's it. Because as you'll know, you can have mortgages for 10, 20 years. The vulnerability that you display on day one may be different. It might not exist 10 years into the mortgage. And even if the vulnerability is the same, the support mechanism might change. So I'll use the example of someone that's partially sighted. Their support mechanism initially might be that they need large print. However, that vulnerability might then change over time to the point where they lose all of their sight, and the support mechanism might then be braille, or it might be verbal interactions only. So I think it's very important that we identify vulnerabilities and agree a support mechanism that's suitable at that moment in time. But it's really, really important that we maintain that through the lifetime of our relationship with that individual. The way that we do it at Darlington Building Society is we'll basically set ourselves a calendar event. So we'll make a note to check in every 6 to 12 months. We'll then very informally touch base with that customer and just say, you told us 6 or 12 months ago that you had X, Y, and Z, and the support you needed was X, Y, and Z. Is this still the case? If it is, we'll then re-diarise it. If it's changed, we'll amend it. If they say, actually, I don't think that I'm vulnerable anymore and there's no support that I need, we can remove that from our system. So I think it's really important, again, because it's the right thing to do, that we hold the up-to-date information, but then you start breaching into the territory of GDPR. And if we've got a note on in 20 years' time that is no longer relevant, there's no need for us to hold that note on our systems. So that's the way we do it at DBS. I'm sure as mortgage brokers, you can kind of utilise the tools at your kind of disposable and the kind of systems that you've got to ascertain what the best way is for you if you're kind of going to touch base with that customer every year, every 2 years, every 5 years, or what have you. But that's the way we do it at the society. We need to make sure that it's up to date in respect of the vulnerability and the support that we're given.
Yeah. So the key bit is communication, isn't it? And when those flags are on there, those identifying factors are there, you've got kind of notes to look back on to continue that conversation. If there hasn't been any vulnerability before, as you said, Dan, that doesn't mean there isn't going to be in the future. So it is still important to have those conversations as if it was a brand new person that you were onboarding for a dip or a mortgage or wherever that might be. So communication, it's something you do already, something we do already, and it's just channeling it down to identify these things. But I think those are some really, really good points that we've gone over, Dan. If you've got like a summary that you would like to kind of finish off with to tell everyone some kind of key points for them to take away, if they could only take away a few bits of information from this session, what would you kind of think?
Absolutely. So I think vulnerability, it's here, it's relevant, it's not going anywhere. The scrutiny is only going to get further from the regulators. So ultimately, now is the time to improve the way that we deal with and interact with vulnerable customers. It's only going to get more prominent. There's only going to be potentially more vulnerabilities based on kind of external factors. So I think vulnerability is important. Therefore, now is the time to get our ducks in a row and start doing the right thing. There's very clear guidance out there as to what the right thing looks like. I would really urge everyone just to kind of refresh themselves on the FCA expectations for the fair treatment of vulnerable customers and really look at that grid. It's kind of a third of the way through the document, and it will very clearly lay out what the FCA perceive to be a driver of vulnerability. The key is that 49% of individuals are going to display one thing that's within that grid. The key then is actually ascertaining whether they are vulnerable or not, and we'll only get there by having that strong communication, that strong conversation. In the instances where we do identify that our client or our applicant is vulnerable, the right thing then is to say, what support do you need? Get their consent and share it with the lender that you're placing that business with, hopefully Darlington Building Society. And then from there, it's up to the lender to follow their policies and do the right thing. And ultimately, we're a team and we all have the same end objective, which is doing the right thing for a vulnerable customer, because it's the right thing to do and because we have to, based on legislation that's out there and expectations and the regulators.
I love that little plug that it's coming with Darlington. I hope everyone takes, from my world as a BDM, I hope everybody takes that little bit away, that we're always open to business. I've been checking on the Q&A chat. It doesn't look like we've actually had any questions. So if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to drop something in the chat now. We've still got a few more minutes that we can pick that up for. Let's have a look.
Yeah, I think they're just going in the chat, James, rather than the Q&A section.
Thank you very much. That's what happens when you get the blind person to lead the questions. Here we go. Right. James Daniel, what would be the way forward? Oh, another one's gone in there. What would be the way forward if you think the client may not be ready to make a decision on taking a mortgage, move, or family are not supportive? Would we still submit, and would you make the decision?
That's very interesting. I think it's going to be a little bit of a boring answer, but it's going to be a case by case basis, depending on what that vulnerability is and whether that's what's affecting their decision making. Ultimately, if they're vulnerable from a health point of view, but ultimately that's not what's driving the decision of the kind of uncertainty, then it would just treat them as normal or kind of follow your normal usual process. However, if they're saying that because of their vulnerability, they don't feel that they're in the best place to make that decision, then that's the support mechanism that they need. It's more time. It's time to reflect. It's time to understand. And I think when we link that back into Consumer Duty, where consumer understanding and consumer support are so kind of prevalent, the right level of understanding and the right level of support is to give that individual more time, particularly if that's linked to the vulnerability. So I would say that we give them all of the information that they need to make an informed decision, and then it's up to them as an applicant, as an individual, to make that decision, vulnerable or not vulnerable.
Yeah. So from a kind of reporting point, you would probably still expect to see maybe a potential vulnerability highlighted to us, where we could then, further down the line, identify that and chat around it.
Of course you would, yeah. And I think, if they said this is my vulnerability and this is the impact it's having on me, I struggle to make decisions, we would then put a lot of faith in the mortgage broker that they're only submitting the business once that customer had gave the go ahead with that mortgage. However, it's brilliant for us to know, because in 2 years' time, their product might be coming to an end and that vulnerability might still be impacting their decision making. So absolutely let us know that that's their vulnerability and that's the way that it impacts them, i.e. their decision making, because that's something that we're going to need to kind of maintain and manage throughout the relationship that we have with that customer as a responsible lender. So yeah, brilliant. Absolutely let us know. And then it's kind of up to us once the mortgage completes to make sure we're doing the right thing moving forward.
Yeah. But the broker's done their job successfully identifying it to us, and then we can implement whatever's required. Brilliant. 100%. Thank you, Dan. Now, this is another question. I think there's probably be the last one, and then we'll do a bit of kind of an outro. But Dan, are you worried the loss of the advice trigger in July will bring worse consumer outcomes for these potentially vulnerable customers? That is a really good question.
That is a really, really good question. I think ultimately, again, it's going to depend on the vulnerable customer, what that vulnerability is and the way that it's impacted them. But I think that ultimately we need to make sure that our advice that we're given to the people that are sat in front of us is the right advice irregardless. Now, for a vulnerable customer, it's very clear that they kind of understand the advice that they're being given and why we believe it's the more suitable mortgage for them, the more suitable term, the more suitable product. And I think ultimately that should be the way that we go ahead with every single one of our clients, whether they're vulnerable or not. But I think that once there's a vulnerable customer in front of us, we just need to be really, really sure and confident in the conversations that we're having to make sure that the advice that we're giving is the right advice for them.
Yeah, I think the challenging thing is with the changes coming in, and there's going to be a lot more kind of ease to do an execution only mortgage. That's going to take potentially away that interaction. And if there's a vulnerability already highlighted on there, where is that going to sit? It might be a little bit too early for us to kind of tell where that's going to sit, because that feels like a very kind of business oriented thing. If someone's hitting the triggers for an execution only, do we take the advice away? I think that'll be one we'll probably need to look at, Dan, and probably give a little bit more info.
It's something that has kind of, I was going to say it's came into our world before, but ultimately I think it's doing the right thing for that customer. And it might be that the support mechanism that's suitable for them is advice only rather than letting them do the execution only. But again, it's going to be a case by case basis. And if you're unsure, run it by us as a lender.
Yeah, good question. Love that one. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you again so much for joining us. We are going to get out on email the link to the video, which you'll be able to watch. Video, how old am I? Get the video on YouTube. We'll have details of your local BDM as well. We are looking to do another session in the autumn. That's probably going to be a little bit more criteria driven, but please look out for it in your emails. And once again, thank you for spending your time with us today. I will look forward to seeing you on the next one. Dan, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you. See you all later. Thank you. Bye.